Hello there, welcome. Let's get right to the point, eh? The creepy, cryptic, pointy point. Summoners. For those who may know me as a player, it should be no secret that I've been a huge fan of the class for many years now. Kabbalists have always interested me due to their aesthetics, their place in the lore, and even their unique, albeit curious, design.
So I figured that they were going to have kind of a dark feel to them, and maybe more of a tribalistic feel, a more Kabbalistic feel. It's just sort of like padded leather and kind of blades and sort of an elaborate headdress that kind of looked tribal. It kind of had that shamanistic feel to it. It would use the demonic parts like horns and bones and skin to protect themselves from the demons, but also to kind of pull that power inside of them.
So what is their design exactly that makes them unique? To speak of the Kabbalist faction in general before focusing on summoners specifically. The Kabbalist faction never had an attribute that increased damage, the way Templars had strength and Hunters had accuracy, though the latter increased critical damage, so it wasn't technically a base damage booster. So out of the 4 attributes in the game, strength is for Templars, accuracy is for Hunters. Stamina gives health, so that's generic. That leaves willpower. Willpower was the Kabbalist's main focus, as evidenced by gear requirements, and it increased the available power pool and its regeneration rate. The power pool would naturally be useful to both Kabbalist classes, as Evokers would spend the power to cast spells, while Summoners would have a portion of their power pool reserved to maintain minions. But be that as it may, willpower still did not increase base damage. The design of both classes simply did not include such a factor. Why is this relevant in this discussion then, and why is it important enough to mention beforehand? Because it massively influenced the Kabbalist design. Unlike the other factions, Kabbalists had to rely on skill synergies first and foremost. Then on the practical side, players depended on the base power of focus items, relics that provided damage, and later in the history of the faction, critical damage through critical builds. However, Flagship's initial class design arguably didn't have such aspirations. So let us explore the initial class design and the later dark form, whose implications are visible today in London 2038. First on the list, demons. Demons were the main minions of the class, being much more powerful than other minions, and each having 2 commands unique to them. Only one could be used at a time. And given the practical limitations that came with a limited number of skill points, the player would have to choose one and build around it. Being very distinct in their roles, demons would conceptually allow summoners to specialize in any one of the 3 main traditional MMO roles: tanking, healing, or dealing damage. So the Carnagor would serve as the tank minion. Its commands were Enrage and Meat Shield, the former being a command to attack a specific enemy, and the latter being an AoE taunt. The Witch Doctor would be the healer minion, naturally. Hand of Nostrum would augment its healing ability, while Dominate would add a unique utility to its arsenal, the ability to control the mind of an enemy. While not the most practical skill to use in battle, Dominate is arguably one of the most clear references to Hellgate's lore. Controlling the minds of demons was an established power of many Kabbalists after all, one that new recruits would train to master. The Witch Doctor would heal the player and their minions, as well as other players that were in the player's party. This arguably made it the most party-friendly minion. The Warper then was the damage dealer. Its commands, Spellstorm and Spectral Strike, would allow the player to force the Warper to attack multiple enemies or focus on one, respectively. So, demon command skills would also belong to a skill group almost exclusive to them, Mind Power. Presumably this design would allow the player to alter their behavior, say decreasing their cooldowns. However, this sadly never happened, so while other skill groups did get affixes specific to them, Mind Powers did not. The class would offer one more main minion, however, one so powerful, at least in theory, that it would not be constantly deployed: the Reaper. Probably the most iconic of Hellgate's demons, the Reaper could only be summoned for a limited duration, and if the opening cinematic is to be trusted, that's probably in the summoner's best interest. Lastly, in an effort to support demons further, the tab offered Bloodlink and Summoning Circle. Bloodlink would allow the player to sacrifice their own health to heal their demon. While not the most practical way to heal, considering that engineers get to do so without the cost, the class skill set does provide ways to alleviate the loss. Summoning Circle would provide added health to demons. Sadly, Flagship chose to word the effect rather questionably, causing confusion to the players for years to come. The skill stated that it buffed minions, which in this case refers to demons. However, affixes that use the term minion affected both demons and elementals, causing many to assume that Summoning Circle also did. Speaking of elementals then. Elementals were lesser demons that could be summoned in higher numbers. The summoner could control up to 10 of each type, except for the spectral one, which was limited to 1, for reasons that continue to elude me 12 years later. Each had its own role, and each was based on one of the 5 elemental damage types available in the game: fire, spectral, physical, electric, and toxic. Naturally, this meant that summoners could, in theory, deal any elemental effect that came with the 5 elemental damage types, namely Ignite, Phase, Stun, Shock, and Poison, not unlike Evokers, their Kabbalist brethren. So fire elementals dealt single-target fire damage through a ranged attack, but were rather fragile. In an attempt to make them more valuable, since they were the elementals that the player started with, they also had a passive skill dedicated to them, Master of the Flame, which increased their damage. The Spectral Elemental dealt AoE spectral damage centered on its melee attack, and was relatively more durable. Now, Force Elementals dealt very minor physical damage with their melee attacks, but were by leaps and bounds the most durable. This advantage would make them wildly popular in any build for years to come, as they provided rather reliable tanks. Storm Elementals dealt electric damage through a ranged, constant attack. The nature of this attack made them very effective against flying enemies, as their description states. But as all ranged elementals, they too were quite weak defensively. Lastly, Toxic Elementals dealt toxic damage through a ranged attack. What diversified them from their fire brethren was that their attack also produced a small toxic field at the point of impact, providing more damage over time. So conceptually, the elementals were rather similar to the marksman's grenades. One of each damage type, each with an effect related to each damage type, even down to toxic being the one associated with field damage. However, while grenades would have synergies with each other, which I personally find to be a superior design choice to be honest, elementals would be tied together by Elemental Nova and Master of the Elements. Nova would provide what the class seemingly lacked most: AoE damage centered on each elemental the player controlled. This would incentivize the players to get as many elementals as possible to make the most of this skill, which arguably cemented one of the most popular summoner builds for many years, the 41 elemental build, dubbed by players as the Zoo build. Lastly, Master of the Elements would reduce the power cost of all elementals, facilitating such builds and tying elementals together. So those are the minions. Is there anything else? Absolutely. Summoners are Kabbalists after all, so they do share much of a skill tab with Evokers: the Necromancy tree. The Necromancy tree, oddly, would become the battlefield of the class's development moving forward. This is where the crucial changes to the class would later take place, presumably because the tab offered more room, and was more of a utility tab than a central one to begin with. Initially, skills were not split in tabs at all, so the only means of grouping skills together was skill trees, and to a lesser extent, skill groups. During the Abyss expansion, Flagship would introduce the tab system, where Necromancy would first be mentioned as a term. This is when the tab also received its most drastic addition, in the form of Dark Form. The tab would also see the addition of the Toxic spell tree in Hellgate Global, but since this retrospective focuses on the initial class designs, as their original creators made and developed them, this version of the tab will not be discussed here. So the tab got its name through its main skill tree. Afterlife would consume nearby corpses to heal the user, providing a unique mechanic that other classes did not make use of, using enemy corpses. The tree would then split into Blood Surge and Drain Life. Blood Surge continued the theme of using one's life to fuel effects. In this case, life would be used to restore power. Interesting as it might have been in concept, this did not benefit a class that did not spend much power to begin with. Summoners would mainly have their power pool reserved for minions, after all. Drain Life, on the other hand, proved to be a great way to actually spend power, while also alleviating the life costs that came with both Blood Surge and Blood Link. Using a focus item, Drain Life would produce up to 8 constant beams that dealt minor damage while healing the user. Bromscares continued this theme by marking enemies and returning life to the user whenever said enemies were hit by them or their minions. Like the Witch Doctor, this also provided parties with another way to heal, as party members would also be healed when they dealt damage to marked enemies. Last on the tree, Elemental Drain would provide a means of reducing the elemental defenses of a single enemy. This further built on the concept of elementals applying elemental effects, and also assisted parties in this front. Lastly, the tab offered two independent utility skills, Word of Fear and Blink. Word of Fear would apply fear to enemies in a radius centered on the user. Blink, on the other hand, would teleport the player towards the direction they were facing. Both of those skills provide the last missing pieces in the class design, some form of crowd control and a panic button for getting out of harm's way. This initial design would make summoners play more defensively than most classes, usually using guns to deal damage from afar. However, as solid as the design was in theory, it was arguably quite vast and skill point demands were high. This would be made very clear during the TC, and even in the later Hellgate Global, where a popular endgame option would be the Master's Hand. This mind control weapon was not actually used for controlling enemies. Rather, two of them were used as sources of more skill points, as each provided one extra point to all of the class's skills. It's only fair to assume that Flagship took notice, and likely did not like the fact that this passive game style was what the class resorted to by the endgame. So along with other changes to the class skill set and gear, they also added Darkform, a skill that transformed the class entirely. But since Darkform is such a massive topic in itself and this video has probably dragged on for too long, I'll be dedicating a second part to Darkform and its many implications. Until then, as always, thank you for watching.